Cold open. The transmission arrives at 11:47 p.m. on every radio in the city simultaneously, cutting through music and talk shows and emergency broadcasts with a sound like tearing metal. Marcus Webb sits in his car outside the convenience store where he works night shift, engine idling, half-eaten sandwich forgotten in his lap as the voice comes through his dashboard speakers. It is reading coordinates in a monotone that sounds almost but not quite human, numbers that correspond to locations that do not exist on any map he knows, GPS coordinates that place things in the middle of the ocean, or 300 feet underground, or suspended in mid-air above suburban neighborhoods. The voice says his name. It says Marcus Anthony Webb, apartment 4B, 28047, Gardenia Street, born June 14, 1992, employee number 08437 at Quick Stop Franchises Incorporated. It says these things with the flat precision of a computer reading a database, except computers do not know the scar on his left knee from when he fell off his bike at age 7, do not know the name of his childhood dog that he has never told anyone, because saying it out loud makes him cry, do not know that he is afraid of bridges in a way he cannot explain to therapists who keep using the word phobia when what he feels is not fear exactly, but recognition, as if bridges know something about him that he does not know about himself. The transmission says it is coming from tomorrow. It says it is a warning. It says that at 3:33 a.m. tonight, something will happen to Marcus that has already happened to Marcus, that is happening to Marcus right now in a version of tonight that exists 3 hours ahead of this one, that has been recorded and broadcast backward through time as a courtesy, as a public service, as the only intervention the future is capable of making in its own past. The voice gives him an address, a building on the north side of the city that Marcus has never heard of, a street name that sounds wrong, that sounds like a street name from a dream, or a bad translation, or a place that exists only in the gap between what is real and what is remembered. Then the transmission ends with a sound like a door closing in a very large room, and every radio in the city goes back to whatever it was playing before, except Marcus's radio does not go back. Marcus's radio is silent, and when he reaches forward to change the station or turn it off or do anything to break the silence, he realizes that his hand is shaking so badly he cannot grip the dial, cannot make his fingers work, cannot do anything except sit there while the convenience store's neon sign flickers in his rearview mirror and his sandwich gets cold, and somewhere 3 hours in the future, another version of him is experiencing whatever the transmission was warning him about. He has a choice to make. He can go to work, stock the shelves, sell cigarettes and lottery tickets to insomniacs and shift workers and people who move through the city at night like ghosts, pretend the transmission never happened, pretend his radio is broken, pretend the voice did not know things it could not possibly know. Or he can drive to that address, the one that sounded wrong, the one that his phone's GPS cannot find when he types it in, the one that he somehow knows anyway, knows the way you know how to get somewhere you have been in a dream, following a map that exists in muscle memory instead of in geography. Marcus starts driving. He tells himself he is just checking, just confirming that the address does not exist, that the transmission was a prank or a hack or a weird radio bleed-through from some university art project, but his hands know where to turn the wheel, before his eyes see the street signs, and his foot knows when to brake and when to accelerate, in a rhythm that feels like repetition, like something he has done before, like something he will do again in 3 hours when he reaches the building for the second time, for the first time, for the time that counts. The streets he drives through are familiar but wrong. These are streets he knows, streets he drives every night on his way to work, but tonight they are different. The buildings are the same, but their windows are dark in patterns he has never noticed before. Dark in ways that spell something, if you know how to read them, if you have been taught the language of architectural shadow, if you understand that cities communicate through absence as much as through presence. The traffic lights cycle through their colors in sequences that should not be possible. Green to red without yellow, red to green and back to red before any car has time to move through the intersection. He passes the same parked car 3 times on 3 different streets. A silver sedan with a dent in the passenger door and a parking ticket under the wiper blade that flutters in the wind that should not be blowing because the air tonight is perfectly still, has been still all evening, will be still for hours yet, except in the small spaces where time is moving differently, where tomorrow is leaking backward into today like water through a crack in a dam. The address he is looking for is on a street that his GPS insists does not exist. But there it is, right where he knew it would be. A narrow lane between two warehouses that should be touching, that are touching in every city planning document and property map, but in reality, have this gap, this space, this street that is only 4 blocks long and has only one building on it, a building that looks like an office tower from the 1970s, all brown brick and narrow windows, and the kind of architecture that makes you feel tired just looking at it, makes you feel like giving up is the reasonable response to existing in a world that builds things this ugly and expects you to be grateful for the shelter. Marcus parks across the street and checks the time. 12:17 a.m. He has 3 hours and 16 minutes before the thing that already happened happens to him. 3 hours to decide whether to go inside, whether to trust a transmission that knew his childhood dog's name, whether to believe that tomorrow is trying to save him from itself, or trying to make sure he arrives on time for an appointment that has already been kept by a version of himself that no longer exists except as a recording, as a warning, as a voice on the radio reading coordinates that point to nowhere and everywhere, and here. The building's front door is unlocked. Of course it is. Buildings in these situations are always unlocked, always waiting, always ready to receive visitors who arrive 3 hours early for events scheduled in their own futures. The lobby is empty and lit by fluorescent lights that hum in a frequency that makes his back teeth ache, that makes him think of radio static, of transmissions, of signals bouncing through time like a ball bouncing downstairs, hitting each step in sequence but faster than it should, faster than gravity allows, faster than physics permits, unless physics is different here, unless the rules are different in buildings that exist on streets that do not exist. There is a directory on the wall. One of those felt boards with white plastic letters pushed into slots, listing the companies on each floor. Most of the slots are empty. A few have letters that spell words that might be company names or might be instructions or might be jokes. Floor 7, Temporal Insurance LLC. Floor 9, Tomorrow's Custodial Service. Floor 13, DFT of Preventative Retrospection. And on floor 15, in letters that look newer than the others, less faded, less dusty, Webb Consulting, mine is by appointment only. Marcus takes the elevator to the 15th floor because the stairs are locked, because the elevator is waiting for him with its doors already open, because he has 3 hours to kill and nowhere else to be, and a growing suspicion that going home would not help, that the thing scheduled for 3:33 a.m. will find him wherever he is, will happen whether he is here or in his apartment or at work or driving as fast as he can in the opposite direction. The transmission said it was a warning. It did not say the warning was optional. It did not say he could choose not to listen. It just said, here is what will happen. Here is when, here is where, and the subtext was clear. Your presence is required, has been required, will continue to be required for as long as this loop needs you to complete it. The elevator doors close with a sound like a sigh, and the elevator rises with a smoothness that feels wrong, feels too smooth, feels like floating instead of mechanical lifting. The floor numbers above the door light up in sequence. 1, 2, 3, skip 4, 5, 6, 7, skip 8, 9, skip 10 through 12, then 13, 14, 15. The elevator stops. The doors open. Marcus steps out into a hallway that smells like old carpet and new paint, like someone has been trying to make this place look better but gave up halfway through, settled for covering the symptoms instead of fixing the disease. There is only one door on this floor, at the end of the hallway, under a light that flickers in a rhythm that might be Morse code, if Marcus knew Morse code, if he had spent time learning dead languages for communicating across distances instead of just assuming that cell phones and internet would always work, would always be there, would never be replaced by something older and slower and more reliable in situations where time itself cannot be trusted to flow in the right direction. The door has a nameplate, Well BBB Consulting. Below that, in smaller letters, specializing in temporal discrepancies. Below that, smaller still, walk-ins welcome but appointments preferred. And below that, so small Marcus has to lean in close to read it. Your 3:33 a.m. consultation has been moved to now, please enter. Marcus enters because what else is he going to do? Wait in the hallway for 3 hours, go back down to his car, drive home and pretend his radio is not going to receive the same transmission again at 11:47 p.m. tomorrow and the day after that and every day until he either goes through this door or dies trying not to. He enters because the door is unlocked and the room beyond is lit. And there is a desk in the middle of the room and behind the desk is a person who looks exactly like him but older. Maybe 10 years older, maybe 20. It is hard to tell because the aging is not in wrinkles or gray hair, but in the eyes, in the way this person holds themselves, in the posture of someone who has been sitting in the same chair answering the same questions for so long that sitting has become their natural state, their default, their permanent condition. The older Marcus looks up and says, "You're early, that's good. That means it's working. That means the transmission got through clearly enough that you actually listened, actually came here, actually made the choice to be early instead of on time. Which gives us 3 hours to prepare instead of 3 minutes. Which might be enough, might be just barely enough, if we're very careful and very lucky, and very willing to accept that some versions of you are going to have to not make it through this in order for other versions of you to exist at all." Chapter 1. Marcus sits in the chair that is obviously meant for him. The only other chair in the room, positioned in front of the desk at an angle that suggests the person who put it there knew exactly where Marcus would want to sit, knew exactly how Marcus sits when he is nervous, knew to place it 3 feet back from the desk instead of directly in front of it, because Marcus has a thing about personal space, about maintaining distance, about keeping enough room between himself and other people that he can leave if he needs to, can run if he has to, can maintain the illusion that he is choosing to stay rather than being required to stay. The older Marcus notices this, noticing and smiles in a way that is not quite kind, not quite cruel, just knowing, just tired, just the smile of someone who has had this exact conversation so many times that the words have lost their meaning, and all that is left is the rhythm, the pattern, the dance of information being transferred from one version of yourself to another, across a gap that should not exist but does, has always existed, will always exist as long as you keep making the choices that lead you back to this room, to this desk, to this conversation that you are having with yourself about yourself for the benefit of yourself. Before you ask, the older Marcus says, "Yes, this is real. No, you are not dreaming. Yes, I am you. No, this is not a prank. Yes, the transmission was legitimate. No, you cannot go home and pretend this isn't happening. Yes, there are rules. No, I cannot tell you all of them, because some of them you have to learn by experiencing them, by making the mistakes I made, by paying the prices I paid, by becoming the version of you that sits here and has this conversation with the younger version who just walked in." Marcus wants to interrupt, wants to ask questions, wants to demand explanations that make sense in a framework he understands, in a physics that allows cause to precede effect, in a timeline that moves in one direction at one speed for all observers. But his mouth will not work, will not form words, will not do anything except hang slightly open in the universal expression of someone whose reality has just been revised without their permission, whose understanding of how the world works has just been invalidated by direct experience of how the world actually works when you get close enough to the edges, to the places where the rules are suggestions instead of laws. The transmission, the older Marcus continues, speaking in a rhythm that suggests he has said these words many times before, in this order, with these exact pauses for breath and emphasis, comes from a version of tomorrow that exists in a facility 17 floors below where we are sitting right now. It is broadcast every night at 11:47 p.m. to every radio in a 7-mile radius. But most people do not hear it because most people have learned not to listen, have trained themselves to filter it out as static or interference or a glitch in the broadcast, have developed the ability to unhear things that would require them to change their understanding of what is possible. He pulls out a file from the desk drawer, a manila folder, thick with papers and photographs and what look like printouts of radio transcripts, pages and pages of coordinates and names and addresses. He opens it and spins it around so Marcus can see, and every page is about Marcus. Every photograph is of Marcus. Every transcript includes Marcus's name being read in that flat monotone. Every coordinate points to a location where Marcus is or was or will be at a specific time that has not happened yet but will happen, is happening, has been happening in loops and cycles and recursive patterns for longer than Marcus has been alive. You are not the first Marcus Webb to sit in that chair, the older Marcus says, and his voice has something in it now that was not there before. Something that sounds like grief or apology, or the emotional exhaustion of someone who has been trying to fix something for so long that he has forgotten what it would feel like to succeed. You are the 47th. The first Marcus Webb came here in 2007, right after the facility opened, right after they started broadcasting the warning, right after someone decided that the best way to prevent a disaster was to create a loop that would force the disaster to keep almost happening but never quite completing, to exist in a state of perpetual prevention, to be always 3 hours away from the event that triggers everything. Marcus finds his voice, finds it rough and smaller than he remembers, finds it willing to form only one question out of the hundreds he has. What event? The older Marcus closes the file, pushes it back across the desk, looks at Marcus with eyes that have seen this moment too many times to count and says, at 3:33 a.m., if you do not make the choice you are supposed to make, if you do not go where you are supposed to go, if you do not become what you are supposed to become, then the facility downstairs will achieve its goal. It will successfully broadcast a signal backward through time that is strong enough to reach not just 7 miles but 7 years, strong enough to change not just one night but 1,000 nights, strong enough to rewrite causality itself in a way that makes this conversation, this building, this version of me and you and everyone who works in the facility unnecessary, impossible, retroactively erased from a timeline that will smooth itself over like water filling in the space where a stone has been removed. He leans forward, and Marcus can see that the older version is not just tired but scared, not just exhausted but desperate, not just explaining but pleading. We need to fail, he says. We need you to fail. We need the event at 3:33 to happen exactly the way it has happened 46 times before, exactly the way it is scripted, exactly the way it must happen in order for this loop to continue, in order for tomorrow to keep trying to warn today, in order for the facility to keep existing 17 floors below us in a basement that was built after the building and somehow predates the foundation. Marcus says, I don't understand. The older Marcus says, you will. You have 2 hours and 41 minutes to understand. That should be just enough time for me to explain what you need to know, and not quite enough time for you to fully accept it, which is perfect, which is exactly the balance we need, because if you fully accepted it, you would try to change it, and if you try to change it, you will succeed, and if you succeed, then everything that depends on your failure will cease to have ever existed, including me, including the facility, including the version of tomorrow that is trying to save itself by making sure today happens exactly the way it already did. Chapter 2. The older Marcus tells him about the facility, about what happens 17 floors below ground in rooms that were built in reverse, excavated from the bottom up, carved out of bedrock in a sequence that started with the deepest chamber and worked backward toward the surface, toward the lobby, toward the point where underground becomes above ground and past becomes present. He tells him about the equipment down there, machines that look like old radio transmitters but function like time machines, except instead of moving objects through time, they move information, they move warnings, they move the smallest possible intervention backward through causality, in the hope that knowing what will happen is enough to change what will happen without actually changing it, without triggering the grandfather paradox, without erasing the future that needs to send the warning in order to exist. He explains that the facility was built by a version of the government that does not exist in public records, funded by money that does not appear in any budget, staffed by people who were recruited from futures that have not happened yet, who accepted positions that require them to work backward through their own timelines, aging in reverse, remembering forward, existing in a state that most humans would call madness but which is actually just a different orientation toward causality, a different way of experiencing the relationship between what was and what will be. The transmission that Marcus heard, the one that said his name and knew his childhood dog and gave him this address, is one of thousands that the facility broadcasts every night to people all over the city. People who have been selected by criteria that even the facility staff do not fully understand. Chosen by algorithms that predict who will listen and who will come and who will make the choices that need to be made in order for the loop to continue, for the facility to keep existing, for tomorrow to keep warning today, even though the warnings are not meant to prevent anything but to ensure that everything happens exactly as it must. You were selected, the older Marcus says, because you have a particular relationship with bridges, because you are afraid of them in a way that most people are not afraid of things, in a way that suggests you remember something about bridges that has not happened to you yet, something that will happen tonight at 3:33 if you make the right choice, if you go to the right place, if you do the thing that 46 previous versions of you have done before you died. Marcus feels his chest tighten, feels his breathing speed up, feels the physical sensation of panic starting to build in his body, the way it builds whenever he has to cross a bridge, whenever he has to drive over water, or over heights, or over any gap that requires trust in engineering, trust in the people who built the thing he is crossing, trust in physics and math, and the assumption that structures stay structural, that solid things stay solid, that the world will continue to support his weight, instead of opening up beneath him and letting him fall into whatever is underneath, whatever is below, whatever waits in the spaces between where he is and where he needs to be. The bridge, Marcus manages to say, his voice tight, his throat constricted, his body already responding to information his conscious mind has not fully processed yet. The transmission is telling me to go to a bridge. The older Marcus nods, slow and sad, and resigned to what comes next. The Harrison Street Bridge, he says. It connects the north side to downtown, crosses the river at the widest point, has a pedestrian walkway that is exactly 847 feet long, and is closed for maintenance tonight, has been closed for maintenance every night for the last 3 weeks, will be closed for maintenance tomorrow night, and the night after that, and every night, until the maintenance is complete, or until the city decides that maintaining it is less cost-effective than just tearing it down and making people drive an extra 2 miles to use the interstate bridge. He pulls out a photograph from the file, a surveillance camera image time-stamped 3:33 a.m., showing a figure standing at the center of the Harrison Street Bridge, arms outstretched, facing the water, wearing clothes that Marcus recognizes because they are the clothes he is wearing right now. The jeans with the torn knee, the jacket with the coffee stain on the left sleeve, the shoes he has been meaning to replace for 6 months but keeps forgetting, because they are comfortable even though they are falling apart. In the photograph, the figure is falling. Not jumping, not diving, just falling in a way that suggests the bridge has opened beneath him, has failed in exactly the way Marcus has always feared bridges would fail, has betrayed his trust in exactly the way his fear has always told him bridges would betray him if he ever trusted them enough to cross them without holding his breath the entire time. This happens at 3:33, the older Marcus says, tapping the photograph with one finger, tapping it exactly where the falling figure's face would be if the image was clear enough to show faces, if the camera was close enough to capture expressions. This has happened at 3:33, 46 times before. This will happen at 3:33 tonight, unless you choose not to go to the bridge, unless you choose to ignore the transmission, unless you choose to break the loop and erase everyone who depends on the loop continuing, including the version of tomorrow that is broadcasting warnings to prevent outcomes they need to happen in order to exist. Marcus looks at the photograph and then looks at himself, at this older version who is sitting across the desk explaining causality violations as casually as someone might explain traffic patterns, who is describing time loops as if they are scheduling conflicts, who is asking Marcus to choose to die in order to keep a system functioning that Marcus does not understand and did not ask to be part of and has every rational reason to refuse. What if I don't go? Marcus asks, asking it quietly, asking it like a child asks a parent about consequences, like someone who already knows the answer but needs to hear it said out loud, needs to have it confirmed that the choice is not really a choice, that the options are not really options, that free will in situations like this is just the freedom to choose which version of predetermined you become. The older Marcus reaches into his pocket and pulls out something small and metallic, sets it on the desk between them. It is a radio, an old transistor radio like the kind Marcus's grandfather used to carry, like the kind people used before phones could stream music, before portable meant digital instead of battery-powered. The older Marcus turns it on, and it immediately tunes to the transmission, to that same flat voice reading coordinates, except now the coordinates are different. Now they point to this building, to this floor, to this room, and the voice is reading a time, 2:47 a.m. If you do not go to the bridge, the older Marcus says, speaking over the transmission, speaking in time with it as if he has memorized the words, as if he has heard this exact broadcast enough times that he can recite it from memory. Then the transmission changes. The facility downstairs detects the broken loop and broadcasts a new warning to a new Marcus Webb, someone who shares your name but has a different employee number, a different address, a different childhood dog, that Marcus receives the warning 1 hour and 13 minutes from now, comes to this building at 2:47, sits in that chair, and has this conversation with a version of me who is one iteration older, one loop further along, one step closer to understanding what happens when the facility finally succeeds in preventing the event it was built to prevent. He leans back in his chair, and the movement is slow, exhausted. The movement of someone who has been sitting in the same position for so long that changing position hurts, That shifting weight feels like betrayal of the body that has learned to be still, to be waiting, to be ready for the conversation that repeats and repeats but never quite resolves. I have had this conversation 418 times, the older Marcus says. With 46 different Marcus Webbs who made the choice to go to the bridge, and with 372 different Marcus Webbs who made the choice not to go, who broke the loop, who triggered the cascade that erased them and everyone they had become, and replaced them with a new Marcus Webb, who would have the same conversation 1 hour and 13 minutes later, with a version of me who remembered all the previous conversations but could not prevent them from happening again. Chapter 3. The older Marcus gets up from behind the desk and walks to the window, a narrow slit of glass that looks out over the city, over the buildings that are arranged in patterns that Marcus has never noticed before but can see clearly now. Patterns that form letters if you know how to read them, if you have spent enough time looking down from the 15th floor of a building that should not exist on a street that is not on any map. He stands there with his back to Marcus, looking out at the city that contains both of them, that contains the bridge, that contains the facility 17 floors below with its machines that broadcast backward through time to prevent events that they need to happen in order to justify their own existence. The first time I had this conversation, the older Marcus says, still facing the window, still watching the city, I was sitting where you are sitting now. The person behind the desk looked like me but older. The way I look to you now, the way you will look to the next Marcus Webb if you make the choice to go to the bridge, if you survive the fall, if you wake up in the hospital with the understanding that you have become part of something that you cannot leave, that you cannot escape, that you can only perpetuate by having this conversation over and over with versions of yourself who keep arriving early because they listened to the transmission, because they believed it when it said it was a warning, because they thought understanding what would happen would give them the power to change it. He turns back to face Marcus, and in the fluorescent light from overhead, Marcus can see that the older version is not quite solid, not quite all there, flickering slightly around the edges like a bad video signal, like someone who is halfway between being present and being a recording of someone who was once present but has since moved on to another version of this moment in another iteration of this loop. The facility downstairs, the older Marcus continues, speaking faster now, speaking like someone who has a limited amount of time and unlimited information to convey, was built by a team of scientists who discovered that the universe has a buffer, a short-term memory that exists between cause and effect, a gap of approximately 3 hours during which events that have been set in motion can still be influenced by information from the future, can still be changed if the information arrives early enough, arrives clearly enough, arrives in a form that the past can understand and act upon. He walks back to the desk but does not sit down, stands there with his hands pressed flat against the surface, leaning forward, looking at Marcus with an intensity that makes Marcus want to look away but cannot break eye contact, cannot do anything except listen as the older version explains the mechanics of a prison that is built from time itself, from the gap between knowing and doing, from the space where free will and determinism meet and discover that they are the same thing viewed from different angles. They built the facility to prevent disasters, the older Marcus says, accidents, attacks, events that kill people in numbers large enough to matter to governments and budgets and the equations that calculate whether prevention is more cost-effective than response. They started small, broadcasting warnings about traffic accidents, about building collapses, about the kind of preventable deaths that happen every day because information arrives too late or not at all. And it worked. The warnings reached people who made different choices, who took different routes, who decided to stay home instead of going to work, who lived instead of dying because tomorrow told them what today was planning to do to them. He pauses, and in the pause Marcus can hear the transmission still playing from the radio on the desk, can hear it reading coordinates that now point to the bridge, can hear it giving times and locations and instructions that sound like warnings but function like commands, like scripts that must be followed, like liturgy that must be recited exactly, or the ritual fails and the gods withdraw their favor, and the world returns to the chaos that prayers are meant to keep at bay. But the more they prevented, the older Marcus says, the more they discovered that prevention has costs that are not measured in lives saved but in timelines erased, in futures that were supposed to happen but did not happen because the past made different choices, because tomorrow warned today, and today listened, and tomorrow ceased to exist because the disaster it was built to prevent no longer needed preventing. They created a paradox A facility that exists to prevent disasters cannot continue to exist if it succeeds in preventing all disasters, cannot justify its own funding and staffing and continued operation if it makes itself unnecessary, if it solves the problem it was designed to solve, and therefore renders itself obsolete. Marcus understands in the way you understand things that you wish you did not understand. Understands in the way you understand bad news, or terminal diagnoses, or the ending of relationships that you thought would last forever, but are ending now, are over, are already past tense, even though you are still sitting in them, still experiencing them, still unable to fully accept that what is happening is really happening, and not just a story you are telling yourself about what might happen if you make the wrong choice. So they created the loop, Marcus says, saying it out loud, making it real by speaking it, by putting it into words that exist in air instead of just in the space between his thoughts. They created a system that always almost prevents disasters but never quite succeeds, that keeps the facility necessary by making it perpetually useful but never finally effective, that justifies its own existence by creating problems that only it can solve by not solving them. The older Marcus nods, slow and sad and proud in the way you are proud of someone who has figured out something you wish they did not have to know. The Harrison Street Bridge, he says, is not going to collapse. It is structurally sound, has been inspected, has been certified safe by engineers who know what they are doing and take their jobs seriously and have no reason to lie or overlook problems that could kill people. But at 3:33 a.m. tonight, the facility will broadcast a signal that interferes with the bridge's maintenance sensors, that triggers a false alarm in the systems that monitor structural integrity, that causes the automated safety protocols to lock the bridge and close it to traffic for an investigation that will find nothing wrong because nothing is wrong, because the whole event is manufactured, is staged, is a performance designed to create a disaster that needs preventing so that the facility can prevent it and justify another year of funding, another cycle of broadcasts, another iteration of this conversation between versions of Marcus Webb who keep arriving early and being told that they have to arrive on time or the loop breaks and tomorrow erases itself from having ever existed. Chapter 4. Marcus sits with this information, sits with the weight of it, sits with the understanding that he is not a person in this scenario, but a component. Not an individual making choices, but a part in a machine that requires his participation in order to function, that has been designed around the specific shape of his fear, around his relationship with bridges, around the fact that he is exactly the kind of person who will listen to a transmission that warns him about something he already fears, who will come to a building that does not exist to have a conversation with himself about how to avoid a disaster that is not real, but must be treated as if it is real, or the system that depends on treating it as real will cease to function. How many people? Marcus asks, and the older Marcus knows what he is asking without needing the question finished. Knows because he has asked this question himself in previous iterations, in previous loops, in previous conversations with previous versions of himself who sat in this chair and did the math and realized what the math meant. 496, the older Marcus says. That's how many people work in the facility. 17 floors below us, in shifts that run backward through time, aging in reverse, remembering forward, experiencing their employment from retirement to hiring instead of from hiring to retirement. 496 people whose jobs exist, whose paychecks are real, whose families depend on income that is generated by a system that generates disasters in order to prevent them, that creates emergencies in order to manage them, that manufactures crises in order to solve them and justify the budgets that pay the salaries that feed the families that depend on the crises continuing to exist. He picks up the file from the desk, the one with all the photographs and transcripts and documentation of 46 previous Marcus Webbs who made the choice to go to the bridge, who fell at exactly 3:33, who became part of the loop that keeps the facility functioning. He opens it to a page near the back, a spreadsheet that lists names and dates and outcomes, a ledger that tracks the cost of maintaining the loop, the price paid by each Marcus Webb who participates in the system that requires his participation. Every Marcus Webb who goes to the bridge survives the fall, the older Marcus says, running his finger down the column labeled outcome, showing Marcus row after row that says survived minor injuries or survived minor hospitalized, 1 week or survived full recovery in 6 months. The fall is controlled, is calculated, is designed to be traumatic enough to seem real but not fatal enough to actually kill anyone, to create the appearance of a disaster prevented without creating an actual disaster that would require real prevention, real intervention, real costs beyond the costs that have already been budgeted and approved and allocated to the facility's annual operating expenses. He flips to another page, to a section labeled Psychological Impact, to assessments written in clinical language about PTSD and anxiety disorders and the long-term effects of experiencing a manufactured crisis, of surviving a disaster that was staged, of living with the knowledge that you were used as a prop in a performance designed to justify a budget, to maintain employment, to keep a system functioning that should not function, that should not exist, that should have been shut down the moment someone realized what it was doing, and how and why. Marcus reads the assessments, reads about previous versions of himself, who developed phobias that made it impossible to cross bridges anymore, who could not drive over water or heights or any structure that required trust in engineering, who lost jobs because they could not get to work, lost relationships because their fear made them difficult to live with, lost years of their lives to therapy and medication and the slow process of trying to recover from something that was done to them deliberately, that was inflicted on them as a necessary cost of maintaining a system that required their suffering in order to justify its own existence. Why me? Marcus asks, and it is not a philosophical question, not an existential complaint about the unfairness of the universe. It is a practical question, a logistical question, a request for the algorithm that selected him, that chose his name from however many names were available, that decided he was the right Marcus Webb for this iteration of the loop, for this performance of the disaster that must almost happen but never quite complete. The older Marcus closes the file, pushes it back across the desk, looks at Marcus with eyes that have stopped flickering, that have solidified into something more present, more here, more invested in this particular conversation than in the 417 previous conversations that have led to this moment. Your fear of bridges, he says, is not a phobia. It is a memory. You remember falling from the Harrison Street Bridge at 3:33 a.m. on a night that has not happened yet, but has already happened in a timeline that runs parallel to this one, in a version of tonight where you made different choices, where you arrived at the bridge on time instead of early, where you did not come to this building, did not have this conversation, did not learn that the disaster was staged and the fall was controlled and the whole event was manufactured to justify a budget. He leans forward, and Marcus can see his own face reflected in the older version's eyes, can see himself as he will look in 10 years or 20 years or however long it takes to become this person who sits behind a desk and has this conversation over and over with versions of himself who keep arriving early because the transmission keeps broadcasting and the facility keeps existing and the loop keeps running, because that is what loops do. They run, they repeat, they create the conditions that allow them to continue running. In that timeline, the older Marcus continues, you died. You fell from the bridge at 3:33. And the fall was not controlled, and the disaster was not manufactured, and you actually died from hitting the water from a height that human bodies are not designed to survive. And in the moment before you died, in the gap between falling and impact, in the 3 seconds that it takes to fall 847 feet at terminal velocity, your brain generated a lifetime of memories, a whole existence that branches from that moment, that fills in the space between who you were before the fall and who you would have been if you had survived. That creates a version of you that remembers dying but continues to exist anyway, because consciousness is not bound by the same rules as matter, because memory is not limited by the same constraints as time, because the story you tell yourself about your life can continue even after the life itself has ended. Chapter 5. Marcus stands up from the chair, needs to move, needs to do something other than sit and listen and absorb information that is rewriting his understanding of who he is and how he got here, and what the choices he makes actually mean in a context where past and future are negotiable, where memory is evidence of events that have not happened yet, where fear is not irrational but prophetic, a warning from a version of yourself who has already experienced what you are about to experience, and is trying to tell you to be careful, to pay attention, to remember that bridges cannot be trusted because you have already learned this lesson in a timeline that runs parallel to this one. He walks to the window, looks out at the city, tries to find the bridge from here but cannot see that far, cannot see across the distance between this building and the river, between this moment and 3:33 a.m., between the version of himself who is standing here now and the version who will be standing on the bridge in 2 hours and 14 minutes if he makes the choice that 46 previous Marcus Webbs have made before him. I don't want to go, Marcus says, saying it to the window, saying it to the city, saying it to the version of himself who died in a parallel timeline, and whose memory he is carrying around like a scar, like evidence of an injury that healed but left marks, left changes, left him afraid of bridges in a way that other people are not afraid of things that have never hurt them, that have never betrayed them, that exist only as potential dangers instead of as confirmed threats. I know, the older Marcus says from behind him, his voice quiet, his voice kind, his voice carrying the weight of 418 conversations in which he has said these same words to different Marcus Webbs, who all made the same statement, who all stood at this window and looked out at the city and said they did not want to participate in a system that required their suffering, that needed their fear, that could only continue to exist if they agreed to become part of the machinery that manufactures the disasters it prevents. But if you don't go, the older Marcus continues, then the transmission changes, the loop breaks, the facility shuts down, 496 people lose their jobs, and the version of tomorrow that is broadcasting warnings to prevent disasters that it needs to happen will cease to exist because it successfully prevented a disaster, because it broke the paradox that keeps it functioning, because it did what it was designed to do and thereby made itself unnecessary, impossible, retroactively erased from a timeline that will smooth over the gap where it used to be and pretend it was never there at all. Marcus turns away from the window, looks at the older version who is still sitting behind the desk, still present, still here, still existing in a state that should not be possible if the loop breaks, if the facility shuts down, if the system that creates him ceases to function. He looks at this person who is him but older, who has lived through more iterations of this conversation than Marcus can imagine, who has watched 46 different Marcus Webbs walk out of this room and go to the bridge and fall at exactly 3:33 and survive and become part of the loop that makes this conversation necessary. What happens to you if I don't go? Marcus asks. And he is asking about the flickering, about the way the older Marcus seemed less solid earlier, seemed like he was halfway between existing and not existing, seemed like someone who was already starting to fade, to disappear, to become retroactively impossible if the conditions that created him change. The older Marcus smiles, and it is the saddest smile Marcus has ever seen. The smile of someone who knows exactly what is going to happen to them, and has accepted it, and is ready for it, and maybe even welcomes it, because existing in a loop is exhausting, is painful, is a kind of torture that masquerades as employment, that pays well but costs more than money, that takes years from your life, not by making you die but by making you live the same moments over and over, until the moments lose their meaning, and all that is left is the pattern, the repetition, the endless return to the same conversation in the same room, with the same person who is you, but earlier, you but not yet aware, you but still thinking that choices matter, and decisions have consequences, and free will is something other than the freedom to choose which version of predetermined you become. I stop existing, the older Marcus says, stating it simply, stating it like a fact, stating it like the answer to a math problem that has only one solution even though there are multiple ways to arrive at it. Not just me, but all the versions of me that exist in all the iterations of this loop, all the conversations I have had and will have and am having right now in other rooms on other 15th floors with other Marcus Webbs who arrived early because they listened to transmissions that warned them about disasters that need to happen in order to justify the warnings that prevent them. He stands up from the desk, walks around it, comes to stand next to Marcus at the window, and together they look out at the city that contains both of them, that contains the bridge and the facility, and the transmission and the loop, and all the mechanisms that create the situation they are in, that require them to make choices that are not really choices, that ask them to decide between participating in a system they do not believe in and destroying everyone who depends on that system, continuing to exist. I have lived in this loop for 17 years, the older Marcus says, and his voice has something in it that Marcus has not heard before, something that sounds like hope or relief, or the quiet satisfaction of someone who has been waiting for permission to stop, to rest, to be released from an obligation that has defined him for so long that he cannot remember what it felt like to be someone other than the person who sits behind the desk and has this conversation over and over. 17 years of watching Marcus Webbs arrive early, and listening to me explain the loop and then watching them leave to go to the bridge and fall at 3:33 and survive and eventually become me, become the person who sits behind the desk and waits for the next Marcus Webb to arrive early so I can have this conversation again and again and again until the conversation is no longer words but just a pattern, a rhythm, a sequence of sounds that I make because I am supposed to make them, because the loop requires them, Because this is my job and I am good at my job, and I have been doing my job for so long that I no longer remember what I wanted to be before I became this. Chapter 6. They stand together at the window for a long time, neither of them speaking, both of them looking out at the city that is starting to show signs of late night becoming early morning. The shift change that happens around 2 a.m., when the people who work evening shifts go home and the people who work overnight shifts are deep into their routines, deep into the rhythm of being awake when most people sleep, of moving through a city that is quieter and stranger and more honest about what it actually is, when fewer people are watching it perform the daytime version of itself. Marcus checks his watch. 1:58 a.m. He has 1 hour and 35 minutes before the event that is supposed to happen, before the fall that is controlled but will feel real, before the disaster that is manufactured but will traumatize him anyway, before the moment that will change him from someone who is afraid of bridges for reasons he does not understand, into someone who is afraid of bridges for reasons that are documented in clinical assessments and psychological evaluations, and the files that track 46 previous Marcus Webbs, who survived the fall and joined the loop, and became part of the system that creates the conditions for their own participation. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus says, still looking out the window, still not ready to look at the older version directly, still processing the information he has received, still trying to decide what to do with the choice that is not really a choice, with the decision that has already been made by previous versions of himself in previous iterations of this loop. "You can ask me anything," the older Marcus says. "That is one of the few genuine freedoms you have in this situation. You cannot change the outcome, cannot prevent the event, cannot break the loop without destroying everyone who exists because of the loop. But you can ask questions. You can understand what is happening to you, even if you cannot stop it from happening. That is the gift I can give you, the only thing I have to offer. Explanation without solution, understanding without escape, knowledge that makes the trap visible but does not unlock it." Marcus asks, "Do you remember dying? Do you remember the timeline where I actually fell and actually died, and generated a lifetime of memories in the 3 seconds before impact? Because if that is what happened, if that is where my fear of bridges comes from, then you should remember it too. You should have those memories. You should know what it felt like to die, what the water felt like when I hit it, what the last thing I thought was before everything stopped." The older Marcus is quiet for a long time. Quiet in a way that is different from the pauses he has taken before. Quiet in a way that suggests he is deciding how much to tell, how much truth Marcus can handle, how much of the real explanation should be shared versus how much should be held back for Marcus to discover on his own, when he becomes the older version, when he sits behind the desk, when he has had this conversation 418 times and is ready to have it 419. "I remember dying," the older Marcus finally says, and his voice is different now, is softer, is more vulnerable, is the voice of someone who is not performing a script but speaking from actual memory, from actual experience, from the actual event that created the loop and the facility and the transmission and all the mechanisms that have led to this conversation in this room at 1:58 a.m. on a night that is trying very hard to become a morning, but keeps getting interrupted by the knowledge that 3:33 a.m. is waiting, is scheduled, is inevitable unless something changes that nothing is allowed to change. "I remember the fall lasting longer than 3 seconds, he continues. "I remember it lasting hours or days or maybe years, time stretching in that way. Time stretches in dreams or in moments of crisis when your brain is processing information faster than normal, generating possibilities faster than reality can confirm or deny them. I remember hitting the water, and the water being solid, being concrete, being a surface that did not yield or accept or forgive. I remember the impact breaking things inside me that should not break, that are designed to bend and flex and absorb shock but that were not designed for this much shock, for this much sudden stop, for this much violence condensed into a single moment." He pauses, and Marcus can hear him breathing, can hear the breath catching slightly, can hear the physical memory of dying expressing itself in the body that survived, that continued, that exists now as evidence that the death in the parallel timeline did not take, did not stick, did not become the final version of what happened, but only one possible version among many versions that branch and diverge and run parallel to each other, in a universe that has more dimensions than the 3 we can see, and the one we experience as time. "I remember dying being not painful exactly but surprising," the older Marcus says. "Surprising that it was ending, That all the things I thought I would do and be and become were not going to happen, were being cancelled, were being revised from future tense to conditional, from will be to would have been. If circumstances had been different, if I had made different choices, if the bridge had been trustworthy, or if I had been less trusting, or if the transmission had reached me in time to warn me, or if I had listened when it did. He turns away from the window, walks back to the desk, and Marcus notices for the first time that the older version is limping slightly, favoring his left leg in a way that suggests old injury, chronic pain, the kind of damage that heals but never quite goes away, that leaves you different than you were before, that marks you permanently as someone who survived something that should have killed them. I remember the moment after dying, the older Marcus says, sitting back down behind the desk. His movements careful, his body clearly hurting in ways that he has learned to manage but not eliminate, ways that he carries with him always, evidence written in flesh and bone, and the way he moves through space, that something happened to him that left marks, that changed him, that made him into someone who understands that survival is not the same as being unharmed, that living through something is not the same as coming out of it unchanged. I remember waking up in a hospital that was not in the timeline where I died, but in a timeline that branched from the moment of dying, that took the death as a starting point and said, what if this did not happen? What if instead of dying you survived? What if the fall was controlled and the disaster was manufactured and you were selected to participate in a loop that needs you to almost die but not quite, that needs your fear but not your death, that needs you to be traumatized but not destroyed, because destroyed people cannot sit behind desks and have conversations and explain to younger versions of themselves why they need to go to bridges and fall at exactly 3:33 a.m. Chapter 7. Marcus sits back down in the chair that is meant for him. The chair that 46 previous Marcus Webbs have sat in. The chair that is positioned exactly right for someone who needs to maintain distance, who needs to be able to leave if necessary, who needs to preserve the illusion of choice even in a situation where choice has already been made, where the outcome is predetermined, where the script has been written and the role has been cast, and all that is left is the performance. He looks at the clock on the wall behind the desk. 2:11 a.m. 1 hour and 22 minutes until the event. 1 hour and 22 minutes to decide whether to participate in a system that requires his participation in order to continue existing, to choose between his own well-being and the well-being of 496 people who work in a facility that should not exist but does exist, and will continue to exist as long as Marcus and people like Marcus keep making the choice to go to bridges and fall at scheduled times, and survive in ways that are controlled enough to be non-fatal, but traumatic enough to justify the warnings that prevent them. Tell me what happens after, Marcus says. Tell me what happens after I fall and survive and wake up in the hospital. Tell me what the next 17 years look like. Tell me what I am agreeing to if I make the choice that 46 other Marcus Webbs made before me. The older Marcus nods as if he has been waiting for this question, as if this is the question that matters most, the question that determines whether Marcus will understand what he is choosing or will choose blindly, will participate knowingly, or will be another victim of a system that preys on ignorance, that depends on people not understanding what they are agreeing to until it is too late to disagree. You wake up in the hospital 3 days after the fall, the older Marcus says, speaking in the tone of someone reciting from memory, from experience, from having lived through what he is describing. Your injuries are minor considering what should have happened, considering that falling from that height into water should shatter bones and rupture organs and cause internal bleeding that kills you slowly even if the impact does not kill you immediately. But your injuries are minor because the fall was controlled, because the facility calculated exactly how to stage the disaster so that it looked real but caused minimal harm, so that you would survive but be changed, be marked, be traumatized enough that you would always remember and never forget, and carry the fear with you in ways that would make you useful, that would make you someone who could sit behind a desk and explain to other people why they need to be afraid. He pulls out another file, thinner than the first one, containing what look like medical records, hospital bills, insurance claims, documentation of 3 days in intensive care followed by 2 weeks in a regular room, followed by 6 months of physical therapy and psychological counseling, and the slow process of learning to live in a body that survived something it should not have survived, that carries evidence of trauma in every movement, in every breath, in every moment of being alive. You are diagnosed with PTSD. The older Marcus continues, flipping through the medical records, showing Marcus pages of clinical assessments and treatment plans, and medication schedules. You have nightmares about falling. You develop anxiety around heights and bridges and water and anything that reminds you of the event. You lose your job at the convenience store because you can no longer drive to work, because the route requires crossing the Harrison Street Bridge and you cannot make yourself do it, cannot force yourself to trust that it will hold you, cannot override the fear that tells you bridges betray, bridges fail, bridges open up beneath you and let you fall into water that is hard as concrete. He shows Marcus employment records, tax returns, bank statements, the financial documentation of 17 years spent working for the facility. Working as the person who sits behind the desk and has conversations with Marcus Webbs who arrive early because they listen to transmissions, who come to buildings that should not exist because warnings told them to, who sit in chairs and ask questions and try to understand what is happening to them before they make the choice that has already been made, that is waiting for them at 3:33 a.m. on a bridge that is structurally sound but will fail anyway because failure is scheduled, is required, is the event that justifies the warnings that prevent it. You are recruited by the facility 6 months after the fall. The older Marcus says. Someone from the temporal insurance division contacts you, offers you a job, explains that your experience makes you valuable, that your fear makes you credible, that your trauma makes you someone who can sit across from other Marcus Webbs and explain to them why they need to go to bridges and fall at scheduled times and survive in ways that are controlled but will feel random, that are manufactured but will seem natural, that are performances but will be experienced as reality. Marcus looks at the employment records, looks at the salary that is better than what he makes at the convenience store, looks at the benefits package that includes health insurance and retirement plans and disability coverage that he would need after falling from bridges, after being traumatized in ways that make it difficult to work normal jobs, after becoming someone whose employment is contingent on their willingness to explain to others why they should become traumatized too. Is it worth it? Marcus asks, asking it directly. Asking it as one version of himself to another version. Asking it as someone who needs to know whether the next 17 years will be livable or just survivable. Whether existence in the loop is something that can be endured or something that slowly destroys you from the inside, while maintaining the appearance of functionality, of normalcy, of being someone who has a job and pays bills and exists in the world, even though the world they exist in is not quite the same world that other people inhabit. The older Marcus closes the file, pushes it aside, looks at Marcus with eyes that have stopped flickering entirely now, eyes that are solid and present and more real than they have been at any previous moment in this conversation, eyes that are looking at Marcus not as a component or a participant or someone who needs to be convinced, but as a person, as an individual, as someone who deserves an honest answer, even if the answer is not the one he wants to hear. No, the older Marcus says, saying it simply, saying it clearly, saying it with the authority of someone who has lived the life Marcus is asking about and knows exactly what it costs, what it takes, what it demands from you day after day after day for 17 years or longer. It is not worth it. The money is good, but money cannot buy back the parts of yourself that you lose when you agree to participate in a system that requires your trauma, that needs your fear, that can only continue to exist if you continue to be damaged in specific ways that make you useful to the mechanism that damaged you. Chapter 8. Marcus stands up again. Needs to move, needs to pace, needs to burn off the nervous energy that is building in his body as the clock moves closer to 3:33, as the moment approaches when he will have to make a choice that he has been told is not really a choice, when he will have to decide between his own well-being and the continued existence of a system that employs 496 people whose jobs depend on him going to a bridge and falling at a scheduled time and surviving in a way that traumatizes him enough to make him part of the loop that creates the conditions for more Marcus Webbs to arrive early and have this conversation and make this choice. What if I just leave? Marcus says, turning to face the older version who is still sitting behind the desk. What if I walk out of here right now? Go home. Ignore the transmission, refuse to participate. You said the loop would break, the facility would shut down, you would stop existing, but that sounds like a good thing. That sounds like I would be ending something that should not exist, something that is fundamentally wrong, something that traumatizes people in order to justify a budget. Why would I choose to perpetuate that? Why would I agree to be part of that? The older Marcus smiles, and it is not a sad smile anymore. Not a tired smile, not a resigned smile, but something else. Something that looks almost like pride or admiration, or the expression you give someone when they finally ask the right question, when they finally see past the script and the performance and the carefully constructed logic that is designed to lead them to a predetermined conclusion. You should leave, the older Marcus says, and his voice is different now, is stronger, is more animated than it has been at any point in this conversation. You should walk out of here and go home and refuse to participate, and let the loop break, and let the facility shut down, and let me and all the other versions of me and all the other iterations cease to exist. That is the right choice. That is the moral choice. That is the choice that ends a system that should not exist, that should never have been built, that should be destroyed before it damages more people in ways that cannot be repaired. He stands up from behind the desk, walks around it, comes to stand in front of Marcus, close enough that Marcus can see the details of his face, the lines around his eyes, the gray in his hair that is not just aging but stress, not just time but trauma, not just years but the accumulated weight of 418 conversations in which he has explained to versions of himself why they should make a choice that will damage them, why they should participate in a system that will use them, why they should sacrifice their own well-being for the continued existence of something that should not continue to exist. But, the older Marcus says, and in that single word Marcus can hear everything that comes next, can hear the exception, the complication, the reason why the choice is not as simple as it seems, why walking away is not as easy as just deciding to walk away, why the right choice and the choice you can actually make are sometimes separated by a gap that is impossible to cross even when you can see clearly from one side to the other. But if you leave, the older Marcus continues, if you break the loop, if you trigger the cascade that shuts down the facility and erases everyone who exists because of it, then you will have killed 496 people. Not directly, not physically, not in a way that would make you guilty of murder in any legal sense, but you will have made a choice that results in their non-existence, that removes them from the timeline, that makes it so they were never employed, never collected paychecks, never fed families, never existed in the first place, because the facility that employed them never existed, because the loop that justified the facility never existed because you refused to participate. He reaches out and puts his hand on Marcus's shoulder, a gesture that is simultaneously comforting and restraining, supportive and controlling, the touch of someone who understands what Marcus is feeling and is using that understanding to guide him toward a specific outcome, to shape his decision, to make sure he makes the choice that the system requires even though the system has been revealed to be fundamentally unjust, fundamentally wrong, fundamentally something that should be destroyed rather than perpetuated. You have 1 hour and 11 minutes to decide, the older Marcus says, checking his watch, checking the time, maintaining the schedule that is as much a part of this system as the bridge or the fall or the transmission that warned Marcus and brought him here. You can stay here and talk to me until 3:22, which is when you need to leave if you are going to arrive at the bridge at 3:30, which gives you 3 minutes to walk to the center of the pedestrian walkway, which is where you need to be standing when the sensors fail, and the automated systems lock the bridge and the structure opens beneath you, and you fall into water that has been calculated to be exactly the right depth and temperature and current to ensure that you survive but are traumatized, that you live but are changed, that you continue but as someone different than who you were before. Marcus feels the weight of the hand on his shoulder, feels it as both support and pressure, feels it as both comfort and coercion, feels it as the physical manifestation of a system that presents itself as offering choices while actually removing choice, that creates the illusion of agency while engineering outcomes, that allows you to ask questions while ensuring that the questions lead you to the answers that have already been decided. Or you can leave now, the older Marcus says, removing his hand from Marcus's shoulder, stepping back, creating space, creating distance, creating the physical opportunity for Marcus to walk away, even as the conversation has been designed to make walking away psychologically impossible, morally untenable, the choice that kills 496 people, whose only crime is being employed by a system that should not exist but does exist, and will continue to exist as long as people like Marcus keep making the choice to participate rather than the choice to resist. Chapter 9. Marcus walks to the door, puts his hand on the handle, feels the cool metal under his palm, feels how easy it would be to turn it and pull it open and step through and walk down the hallway to the elevator that will take him down to the lobby, that will let him out into the city, that will be exactly as it was before, except he will be different. He will be someone who knew about the loop and chose to break it, someone who understood the cost and decided that ending a corrupt system was worth paying that cost. Someone who will have to live with the knowledge that 496 people ceased to exist because he refused to fall from a bridge at a scheduled time. He stands there with his hand on the handle for a long time, maybe 30 seconds, maybe a minute. Time stretching in that way. Time stretches when you are making decisions that feel enormous, that feel like they will define who you are and who you will become, and how you will understand yourself for the rest of your life. Behind him he can hear the older Marcus breathing, can hear him waiting, can hear him not saying anything because anything he says now would be manipulation, would be interference, would be the system trying to preserve itself by preventing Marcus from making the choice that would destroy it. Marcus opens the door, steps through, closes it behind him, stands in the hallway under the flickering light that might be Morse code, that might be sending a message he cannot read, that might be trying to communicate something about this building or this situation or this choice he just made or is still making or will make. When he gets to the bottom of this decision and understands what it means, what it costs, what it requires from him, he walks to the elevator, presses the button, waits for the doors to open. They do not open. He presses the button again. Still nothing. He looks back down the hallway at the door to Webb Consulting, at the office where the older version of himself is sitting behind a desk, not trying to follow, not trying to stop him, just letting him make this choice, just allowing him to discover that the choice to leave is not as simple as walking through a door, that the elevator does not work when you try to use it to escape, that the system has been designed with layers of redundancy, with mechanisms that ensure participation even when participants think they are refusing. Marcus walks back to the door, opens it. The older Marcus is standing now. Standing in exactly the position Marcus expected, standing between the desk and the window, standing in the posture of someone who knew Marcus would come back, who has watched 46 previous Marcus Webbs try to leave and fail to leave, and return to this room, having learned that leaving is not an option, that the only real choice is between participating knowingly or participating without understanding, between going to the bridge with full awareness of what is happening, or going to the bridge in ignorance, but going either way, because the system is designed to ensure that you go. The elevator only works in one direction after you enter this building. The older Marcus says, and he is not gloating, is not satisfied, is just stating a fact, just explaining another mechanism of the trap that Marcus is in, that has been built around him, that requires his participation, and has eliminated all the exits except the one that leads to the bridge, to the fall, to the scheduled trauma that will make him part of the loop that will eventually result in him sitting behind this desk, explaining these same mechanisms to the next Marcus Webb, who arrives early because he listened to a transmission. You can still refuse, the older Marcus continues, and Marcus can hear genuine conviction in his voice, can hear that this is true, that refusal is still possible even if leaving is not, that he can stay in this room or stay in this building or stay anywhere except at the bridge at 3:33, and the loop will break, and the facility will shut down, and everyone who exists because of it will cease to exist. But if you refuse by staying here, you will be in this building when the timeline corrects itself, when the facility erases itself from having ever existed, when the causal chain that created this room and this conversation and me unravels and takes you with it because you are inside the bubble when the bubble pops, inside the loop when the loop breaks, inside the system when the system self-destructs. Marcus looks at the clock. 2:47 a.m. 46 minutes until the event. 46 minutes to decide whether to participate in a system he knows is wrong, or to refuse participation, knowing that refusal will erase him along with everyone else, will remove him from the timeline, will make it so he never existed in the first place because the choices he made led to a paradox that the universe resolves by eliminating the person who created it. What happens if I go to the bridge but do not fall? Marcus asks, asking it because there must be loopholes, must be ways to participate without being traumatized, must be options other than fall and be damaged or refuse and be erased. What if I go to the center of the pedestrian walkway at exactly 3:30, but when the sensors fail and the structure opens, I step aside, I avoid the gap, I do not fall? The older Marcus shakes his head slowly, sad again, tired again, back to the expression he wore earlier when he was explaining the mechanisms of the trap, the ways the system ensures compliance, the reasons why 418 previous conversations have all ended with Marcus Webbs going to bridges and falling at scheduled times. The gap will be wherever you are standing, the older Marcus says. The sensors do not fail randomly. The structure does not open arbitrarily. The system knows where you are, tracks your position, ensures that when the moment comes, the floor beneath your feet is the floor that opens, that gives way, that drops you into the fall that has been calculated and controlled and designed to traumatize you in specific ways that make you useful, that make you someone who can sit behind a desk and explain to other people why they cannot avoid what is coming for them. Epilogue. Marcus leaves the building at 3:22 a.m., exactly on schedule, exactly when the older version said he would need to leave in order to arrive at the bridge at 3:30, exactly when all the previous Marcus Webbs left, exactly when the system requires him to leave in order to maintain the timeline, to keep the loop running, to ensure that at 3:33 a.m., something happens that has already happened 46 times before, and will happen again as long as Marcus Webbs keep listening to transmissions that warn them about disasters that need to happen in order to justify the warnings that prevent them. He drives to the Harrison Street Bridge in a city that looks different now, that looks like a stage set, that looks like a performance space where events are scripted and outcomes are predetermined and everyone is playing roles they do not understand in a production they did not audition for, but cannot leave. He parks at the north entrance to the pedestrian walkway, the one that has been closed for maintenance, the one that should be locked but is not locked, the one that is waiting for him with the door open and the lights on and the path clear, all the way to the center where he needs to be standing when the sensors fail. He walks. The bridge is exactly 847 feet long, exactly the distance the older Marcus said it was, exactly the distance that will create exactly the right fall if the structure opens at exactly the right place and exactly the right time. His footsteps echo on the metal grating that forms the walkway, echo in a way that makes him think of the elevator rising too smoothly, of time stretching in moments of crisis, of the way sound behaves differently when you are inside a system that operates according to rules that are not quite the same as the rules that govern the rest of reality. He reaches the center at 3:29 a.m., 1 minute early, 1 minute to change his mind, to turn around, to refuse participation, to break the loop knowing that breaking it will erase him and everyone else who exists because of it, knowing that the right choice and the survivable choice are different choices, knowing that morality and self-preservation sometimes point in opposite directions and you have to decide which one matters more, which one defines who you are, which one you can live with afterward or not live with because afterward you might not exist to live with anything. The older Marcus's words echo in his memory. You should leave. You should walk out. You should let the loop break. That is the right choice. That is the moral choice. But he is here. He is standing at the center of the bridge at 3:30 a.m. on a night that has become morning, on a morning that is about to become a disaster that is controlled but will feel random, that is manufactured but will be experienced as real, that is performance but will traumatize him anyway, because trauma does not care about intentions, does not distinguish between authentic and staged, does not grant immunity to people who understand the mechanisms that are being used against them. The city around him is silent. The river below him is dark. The transmission is over, has delivered its warning, has done its job, has brought him here to this moment where past and future converge, where memory and prophecy are the same thing experienced from different directions, where he is simultaneously the person who is about to fall and the person who remembers falling, and the person who will sit behind a desk and explain to other versions of himself why they need to fall too. At 3:33 a.m. the sensors fail. The automated systems lock. The structure beneath his feet opens with a sound like a sigh, like resignation, like something that has happened before and will happen again, and is happening now in the eternal present of a loop that runs and runs and runs as long as people keep participating, keep falling, keep surviving and being traumatized, and becoming part of the machinery that traumatizes others. Marcus falls. The fall lasts 3 seconds, and lasts forever, and lasts exactly as long as it is supposed to last before he hits the water, that is hard as concrete, but yields just enough to let him survive, to let him live, to let him become the person who will eventually sit behind a desk in a building that should not exist on a street that is not on any map, and explain to younger versions of himself why they cannot escape what is coming, why they cannot avoid what has already happened, why they cannot choose anything except which version of predetermined they become. In the 3 seconds of falling, he generates a lifetime of memories, fills in the space between who he was before the fall and who he will be after, creates the narrative that will carry him through 17 years of sitting behind desks and having conversations and watching Marcus Webbs arrive early because they listened to transmissions that warned them about futures that need to happen in order to justify the warnings that prevent them. He survives. The water breaks his body in controlled ways that have been calculated to cause maximum trauma with minimum fatality. He sinks and then surfaces, floats on currents that have been mapped and measured and predicted to carry him to the rescue point where the facility's recovery team is waiting with medical equipment and transportation and the paperwork that will begin the process of transforming him from Marcus Webb, the convenience store clerk, into Marcus Webb, the temporal insurance consultant, into Marcus Webb who sits behind desks and explains to younger versions of himself why they cannot leave, why they cannot refuse, why they can only choose to participate knowingly, or participate in ignorance, but participate either way, because the system is designed to ensure participation, because the loop requires participants, because tomorrow needs today to keep happening the way it has always happened in order for tomorrow to exist at all. He wakes up in a hospital 3 days later with memories of dying, and memories of living, and no way to know which memories are real, and which memories are generated, and whether there is any meaningful difference between remembered events and actual events, when the remembering is what shapes you, what changes you, what makes you into the person who carries those memories forward into a future that has already happened in a past that has not occurred yet. And 17 years later, he sits behind a desk in a building on a street that should not exist, and waits for the next Marcus Webb to arrive early, to sit in the chair that is positioned exactly right for someone who needs to maintain distance, to ask the questions that need to be asked, to learn what cannot be avoided, to make the choice that is not a choice, to participate in the loop that creates the conditions for more Marcus Webbs to arrive early, and have this conversation, and make this choice, and fall from bridges and survive, and become him, become the person who waits behind desks for younger versions of himself to arrive 3 hours early, for appointments scheduled at 3:33 a.m. The transmission continues to broadcast every night at 11:47 p.m. to every radio in the city. Most people do not hear it. Most people have learned to filter it out as static. But some people listen. Some people arrive early. Some people make choices that are not choices. And the loop continues, runs, repeats, creates the conditions that allow it to continue running, creates Marcus Webbs, who fall and survive, and sit behind desks and wait for the next Marcus Webb to walk through a door that is always unlocked, that is always waiting, that leads to a conversation that has happened 418 times before and will happen again as long as the system that requires it continues to exist, continues to broadcast warnings that prevent disasters that need to happen, continues to create loops that trap people in roles they did not choose but cannot escape, except by choosing to be erased from the timeline entirely, to cease to have ever existed, to become retroactively impossible in a universe that smooths over the gaps where you used to be and pretends you were never there at all.